Welcome, Jeff.
Hello, glad to be here.
Fantastic. So, we're going to be talking about a lot of interesting things today. But let's start with something that when I read your book, the thing that struck me was when you read about big IT projects and so on, nobody talks much about the rollout of India's biometric system. But when you look at the scale of what was involved, there's over 1 billion citizens speaking multiple languages. They had problems in the past, legacy systems, getting it all to talk together. It seemed that it should have failed, but it was rolled out better than expected. So that's the genesis. That's where everything started. Maybe as a starting point, we can talk more about what inspired Infosys to look at this rollout to make all the changes for the living enterprise.
I think there are a few dimensions to it. One is it's not just about that.
Sure.
It's just so noteworthy that it's a good organizing principle. Nanda Nilekani, who is a iconic figure,
Yes.
I don't think I'm stretching to say that, in India and worldwide, was one of the leaders of Infosys from a startup, and 7 gentlemen with a few $100s worth of loans from their wives basically grew this thing. And so it's a great story.
Mm-hmm.
And then he decided to step out and serve the government, in this case, India, and as like a minister almost, to just some large program of applying tech to the masses. And I think after going through this and applying some business concepts in the government, which I think in India is even harder than it is in the US, Western Europe, just to let it go at that, and in applying these principles like do open source, be flexible, take advantage of technology, agility, and then the ability to change rapidly, but really doing it very slowly, incrementally, so people don't feel like their whole world's changing, and then having a vision and driving it through. And of course, the petri dish of 1.x billion people, going from not as far along to as farther along than many people, and needing to do it in a hardened environment, where some of it isn't pristine, lots of documentation, high bandwidth and all that, very much out in villages. And so I think the fact that it was able to be done there, and then he re-entered the corporate world, came back in 2017, beginning, I think that's what made it unique. Take a business concept, apply it successfully at scale and quickly, in a government environment, in a non-Western environment too. I think that's also something interesting. Being able to apply a non-heavy US or Western European bias to something where you have more of a global perspective, and then reapplying it at a time when, I'll be honest, we were going through tougher times at Infosys, which would probably be okay times for anybody else. But the thing that got you to where you were was asymptotically starting to taper off. And so what's the next thing? What's the next big wave and macro trend? And I think that was what made it really interesting, is the applying what worked at scale and being flexible with the IDAR, the India Stack Initiative, into a situation where you had multiple nonlinear convergent technologies, to quote, Peter Diamandis and the others. I think the combination of all those things and trying to do that for a company that was successful, but trying to get past the founder's mentality to a longer term, very global company.
So let's synthesize that a little bit for our listeners, and then we'll take it from there. So the founder, one of the founders of Infosys, steps away from a very successful business to take on a noble role to help the government with one of its signature policy moves, brings in certain principles he knew from Infosys. He obviously made some adaptations for a government project, successfully rolled this out by most conceivable measures, and then he moved back to Infosys. So let's talk a little bit about what did he do differently that made this a success?
First of all, he didn't bring in wholesale change. He worked with the team he had, which is hard, because it's often hard to introduce significantly improved results with the same team. The reason it was so important is we have this term called social capital, that when you get a senior executive team who's worked together for a long time, maybe they knew each other when they were managers and directors and working their way up, there's such a element of trust. Growing up in Indiana and playing basketball, we call these no-look passes. You know what I'm saying? You can anticipate, and there's a trust You have to be the best of friends. There's just a good implied professional trust. I think that allowed several of these things to happen. It's a theme. So
Yes.
bigger decisions could be made because you knew the person, and generally speaking, everyone's pulling in the same direction. And I think there's also the sense that there was something bigger, a bigger purpose, that the company did a lot of good through the foundation, a lot of good for sustainability and other types of things. And trying to go to that next level, there was a lot besides simply trying to squeeze out a few extra dollars. The genie was still in the bottle from that standpoint. And there's a lot of goodwill. I think that people wanted it to be successful. Certainly the press and investors in India, and I think global in the tech world.
Yes.
And I think the other thing that made it successful is our 1,400 plus clients. And it's not meant to be a sales pitch at all. It's just,
Sure.
It's a long relationship. I think like many professional services firms, when you start having 10, 15, 20-year relationships, and you've got hundreds, if not 1,000 people, working together, you buy from, you sell to, and you partner together on offerings. I think that also creates a sense that people want to be successful and do what they can if they sense that the right things are in place.
So he came back to Infosys. And then where does the idea of the living enterprise come from? Was it a deliberate attempt to understand what had worked on this project? Was it an opportunity to synthesize what had worked across many Infosys clients? How does this concept come together? And what is the concept?
The live enterprise is what we call it. And initially, we began thinking about awareness. The world is moving too fast. There's a phrase that I used to use a lot, and I think everybody uses it now, that the business pace moves much more quickly than the ability for companies to conceive of and deliver large programs. Used to be maybe the programs for 5 years, business would move in 2, but whatever it is now, it's less than a year, and you've got to move quickly. But you've got to pour some concrete to build your foundations. Mm-hmm. So there's this dichotomy that really causes angst. And I think the ability to be aware and respond quickly and accurately, that awareness, there's a concept called sentience. Mm-hmm. Sentient beings, which in the U.S. at least has a bit of a sinister view, like the rise of the machines, exactly, or the robots. And so partly because of that connotation, and partly because it was more than simply being aware, there's a living, organic, evolving aspect. So live enterprise was that, but it didn't stop at a marketing buzzword or a phrase. If you peel it back, nature does provide a lot of cues. And if you go into biomimicry, it's a fascinating area. There are some really complex things that happen just below the surface, whether it's the murmuration of birds, how there is no leader, but you take the cues from the 6 or 7 birds around, and they have these fantastic flock formations and movement. So part of it is there's adaptation, and part of it is evolution. Mm-hmm. And there's a micro evolution and a macro. The micro is responding very quickly to change. And then the macro is having the large blocks in place, like capabilities and direction and culture. And if you look at nature, there are the big macro changes over time, and then you have a lot of these small things that are happening almost on a daily basis. And there's another aspect of the live enterprise. People don't realize that nature is experimenting like crazy. And I think that was something we found, rather than trying to be right in the so-called planned economy approach. If you can run many experiments simultaneously, and maybe in a VC kind of way, evolve and promote and reward the ones that work, have a shared infrastructure, we call it a shared digital infrastructure, digital runway, where you can launch the successful ones and get them to scale, so small teams can get the benefit of this large shared digital platform, then it works. And those are the concepts that, taken together, even though it's very digital, it's live enterprise because it's really amplifying a human's ability. We call it maximum human intuition and minimum human intervention. So you can automate the things that are repetitive, but really bring out those decision and intuitive aspects that allow better decisions to be made.
So let's think about it this way, right, to help our listeners. So imagine that you have a client who is the CEO of a large Fortune 1000 financial services company. And you've obviously, you've got a lot of experience talking to these people, helping them frame their issues and so on. I think a lot of them would tell you they're already doing this. And I'm not saying they are already doing this, but they will believe they're already doing this. How would you help them understand what they could be doing better by incorporating these principles? What should they be doing differently?
The first thing is to have a dose of humility and say, that sounds great. Can you share the results?
Yeah.
Are you happy with them? There's a good chance that unless we're already in a close relationship, maybe over the years, that the only reason we're speaking is because there is something that they're not quite happy with. Maybe it costs a lot more, or it takes way too long to accomplish these things. Or maybe, and we see this a lot, they've got pockets. The phrase pilot purgatory is out there. A lot of folks do something small.
Yeah.
And there's no bigger fan of design thinking than me. And yet one of the things that I noticed, as part of the lead group at Infosys, where several of us would go out there and move it, that a lot of companies, you've got these pilots, or proofs of concept, experiments, you show a result, and it's localized, but it never scales. And as a result, you can't do anything large and complex unless you pull them together. Same thing with Agile. The folks in a garage in Silicon Valley can create a product, but can you manage 125 Scrum teams at once?
Yes.
Can you do it when you're not all in the same room? Can you do it for infrastructure and architecture and things that don't lend themselves to feature enhancements, or to very non-tech processes? That's where we saw companies struggle. And it also, let's face it, you can't all hire the top data scientists from Stanford. Yeah. What about the broad part of the pyramid? There are digital skills that are needed, whether they're data analysts, whether they're process automation folks, but they might not be designing the next algorithm, but they're perpetuating it throughout a company. And I think that's where people struggled, is how do you integrate these good concepts like design thinking and even some of the lean startup types of things at scale? And you either had a strategist who could go to the whiteboard, do frameworks, and lay out your good plan, or you had the plumber who could do things with APIs and cloud, and you could revision this, and you could automate that. But you didn't have this integrated viewpoint. And last but not least, the architecture, that scaffolding that's required, it was way too rigid or brittle. It wasn't flexible. And it's almost like it was an oxymoron. What do you mean flexible architecture?
Yeah.
You have it because it's your structure. And I think building that flexibility, and these are the things that we saw executives struggle with. And to be honest, they weren't doing it at scale. And so that's what bubbled up in our discussions.
So would you say that companies have these competencies, they do it well in pockets, they do it well in pilots, but it's the ability to do this at scale is the defining limitation for them?
The ability to do it at scale is absolutely a limit because, one, there aren't that many people with experience doing that.
Yeah.
They either have been in pockets or they've been part of a machine. Like we've sometimes, several years ago, there's this rock star join the company, but they might struggle for a while because they left a system and they were as much a product of that system as they were the ability to create a system or adapt it. And sometimes it's because they came from a great firm who had that mindset, whether it's the way to do consulting or that way to implement technology, or even a good HR system.
So people. As you know very well, and even when I was back in the day a partner talking to clients and so on, most companies and the executive team barely has the bandwidth to do what they're doing, let alone the bandwidth to go back and do a little bit of an autopsy, extract best practices, think about what worked, capture that knowledge, document it, roll out training and so on. So in your experience, how do you get executives to step back when they don't even have time to breathe? How do you get them to pause, reflect, adjust, experiment? It must be difficult to do that.
It is. There are a couple of things. One is you've got to think about the employee experience, including the executive's experience, like you do the customer experience. I think we did ourselves a disservice in business for many years where we would claim customer-centric. Yet our employees got those green screens or they got the crappiest systems. Basically they get the leftovers. And yet we would say they're our best asset, right? The most important asset. And so again, that was a bit of a dichotomy. So one, I think there is a renewed effort, and of course the COVID the remote work has also done that, is realized we better make sure our people are productive and we care for some other needs. And it isn't just a few Silicon Valley folks all clamoring for the same talent, for free food in the cafeteria and bringing your dog. It's all these different aspects of making it easier. The second thing is when there's this other responsibility built in, this idea of learnability and improvement that actually is hardwired into your metrics. I don't mean in a tactical way. I mean in a cultural way. Several of the offers in our own company across this live enterprise journey, they've come from somebody who led our training and the platform worked well, and eventually it became an offering. Things that we were doing with cloud, things that we're doing in our own company. In fact, Nandan Nilekani, one of the core principles was we can't take anything outside until we show that it worked internally first.
Yes.
So it's different from a lot of companies, but it forced people to think like that. And so I also believe that we're long past the hardcore hierarchical models for the organization. But still, I think many companies have vestiges of that left. I believe when the executives are viewed by their skills and expertise and their ability to do something, not just manage something,
yes,
I think you have more time freed up. And you and I have that background in consulting where the partner is kind of the expert in doing certain things. They're not an administrator.
Yes.
It can't be. And I believe that has crept into the more successful companies. If you look at, Rafi, my co-author with this, I would put him up against any technologist on the planet. He's more or less our CTO. He's the head architecture for the entire company. And yet he's in the engine room all the time. He is as good a practitioner as you're going to get. And our president, Ravi Kumar, down the list as you talk to people, they're pretty hands-on.
Yes.
And so it does amaze me. But I think what happens is you just focus on what's most important. You delegate as much as you can to your next level for those things that maybe in the past, as a leader, you may have taken on. It's a development opportunity for them. And when you start realizing your path to impact is through being a practitioner, an expert practitioner, as well as it is making decisions and pushing information to different people, then I think you start to get the right result, and you start to leave that old, I don't have time for this behind.
So speaking to, I think it was Ram Charan or Gary Hamel, I can't remember who, and they were making a very similar point you were making, because it seems that it boils down to whether you can find a way to treat your employees not as an abstraction or an obstruction or someone you need to manage very tightly, but you got to find a way to almost unleash them and create systems and processes, incentives whereby employees almost run little businesses by themselves, which is a different model from the way businesses traditionally run itself, right? They have this very hierarchical top-down structure. We'll tell you what to think. We'll tell you what to do. We don't want you to do anything except what we want you to do.
That's so well put, because if you flip the organizational model and all of a sudden your leaders are on the front line, they're handling your hardest problems, or socially, or org design. First of all, deep down, every good leader wants that. You know why?
Yeah.
That's what got them into doing what they were doing. They dread looking at 200 evaluations and hitting that button over and over on how many approvals and who's rating and adjudicating disputes and budgets. All important. At the same time, there is such a sense of productivity and impact through that. And of course, now with the tools we have, you can reach so many people directly. And people have social media presence. They have that inside the company. So you have followership, and there are all kinds of implications there. And we just see that as a natural tendency that good companies today, the ones that can move quickly, their leaders seem to be in two places at once. They're doing the old types of work, they're getting it done, and yet they're also very visible. How does he or she have time to be on that panel?
Yes.
How does he or she have that time to be on that steering committee for the new product rollout or the new org design or the new, whatever that's going on in the company? And again, if you're in professional services, whether it's investment banking or advertising, accounting, consulting, you get that because that's the partner model or that producer model. But I think for business, people gravitated. I remember Tom Peters reading some of his things early in my career, and he had a few sayings about where things were going. And in some cases, he was a little ahead of his time, but they were right. We came to a project mentality, to people emulating the professional services firm approach because it's fluid and it evolves. And the trick is, how do you make it work, though, beyond one team or a dozen or the amount that a partner, so to speak, can manage? That's the trick. And I also think that there's been two or three, besides just general tech, two or three advancements that's helped. One of them, and I think it's not gotten the play that it should, until certainly we put it out there, is this idea of a knowledge graph. People know about Facebook's social graph and Google, the ability to map everything that's going
All
on in your
institutional
company.
knowledge.
Yes. And you've got
that's
the
pretty
latent
impressive
as well as it is. And I'm telling you, I did not appreciate that until really digging in with the book. Because again, Rafi, my co-author, and a lot of the tech folks in the engine room were doing some things bottoms up that have made a lot of this possible. The other thing is what we call a digital brain. I know it sounds corny, but the ability to have these rules. Some are deterministic, which is a great place to start. RPAs everywhere, robotic process automation. And then you can start to move towards this awareness. When you've got such inexpensive sensors and you have so much going on, you can start to have these rules-based decisions, which again, the more of those that happen and the easier. It's like an Iron Man suit. All of a sudden humans can get so much more done. The combination of those two things, I think, has also allowed senior people to act more quickly, more decisively, with greater confidence.
So I want to stitch together some of the very interesting points you're making so the listener can piece it together as well. I'm going to go through step by step and just make sure we're getting it for them, right? The first thing we're talking about is in a live enterprise, you move away from a system whereby corporate manages employees to corporate finding a way to support employees at doing what they do very well. Is that a good way of summarizing it?
Yes, I really like that word unleash, because if you hire good people,
let's go with unleash.
Yes, they want to do that, and you're giving them the opportunity to do so, and you're rewarding the ones that do it the best.
Okay, that's good, because I think when people listen to this, that's what we're talking about. It's a significant mindset shift, because everywhere you look, whether it's media, whether it's most MBA programs, whether it's most corporate training programs, people seem to gravitate towards a command and control structure because they think being a boss that tells people what to do is a sign of success. And we're saying that's not the best way to get what you need from your employees, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then the next part, which I really liked, and I do want to unpack this, because I'll give you some examples. I speak to a lot of senior partners in consulting firms. And one of the points I always make to them is that the firms can do much more, be more effective if they had a way to capture their institutional knowledge, document it, and make it quickly available to whomever needs it anywhere in the organization as soon as they need it in the format they need it, so they can do their job without any friction. And everyone tells me, yeah, we have a knowledge management system, and I'm telling them that's not the same thing. So let's talk about this knowledge map and what you call the digital brain, because let's unpack how that can give companies an advantage. Because I think a lot of people think they are doing it, but all they have is a few files in a database somewhere that is not correctly tagged and coded, and it's not the same thing.
Mm-hmm. I think there's two aspects. Let me start with the tech piece first, that even if you want to do some of these things, you might knit your brow and say, oh no, this is another 3-year program. By the time I implement it, we'll be doing something else. Why bother? What's interesting, or we have such institutionalized systems and legacy systems that's hard to change.
Yes.
What we did, and what we see a lot with clients, there's this phrase that sounds pretty boring, but it's important: legacy modernization, where you say, you know what, we're not going to touch those millions of lines of code. In some cases, mainframes or whatever's been around. But you build something around it and you extract it, and you can create a mobile app or a better skin, better interface. And we had something like 120 employee applications, everything from your time to your health and travel,
wow, that's a lot.
which, in a global company, there's lots and lots of things. We consolidated them to 4, and their apps. And again, they're all very secure, authentication and all those types of things. The first thing was do it fast via the app. And then gradually we're going back to reskin some of the things. So we didn't have to spend lots of time. And by the way, we didn't do this all at once. Every 6 weeks, the entire company clicks one step closer to wherever it needs to be. So every 6 weeks, there's a release. 6 weeks was enough to get something substantial done. And yet we're moving. And it isn't such a big change that people can't adopt. We use this phrase micro change management. There are things like tiny habits, atomic habits, nudge. You've seen these books out there, and we took them to heart, that a lot of the psychological underpinnings in organizational behavior, if you give somebody a nudge, they don't feel like it's a big change. I'll just incorporate my routine. And every 6 weeks, next thing you know, you look back a year later, I made a bunch of small changes, and we're in a very different place right now. which is good, and we're not going back. That's change management, not this massive forms-driven PMO office, lots of meetings flying around and fancy collaboration workshops. It's just when you make changes. And again, this is based upon, as they say, the science and small changes. The key, though, is these are small changes that you don't go back to where you were before.
Yes.
So the other thing is that the processes that you have and the work that you're doing, you need to reduce the perceived value of fiefdoms. Because I don't know about you, but I've been on the good side and the not so good side earlier in my career about places that thought if you knew something, it was valuable. And if I shared too much, then, and I've been in places that's the opposite. It's just flowing.
Yes.
Everybody was going at the result for the client, for the engagement, and those are just wonderful places that attract people because you can focus on the work.
Yes.
And you feel like you've got support. And I also submit that a small company who properly harnesses all their information will run circles around a large one that's in silos. Because I've been there. I've been the underdog. And it was really neat to be able to bring more information to the table and appear to be having the upper hand compared to that behemoth that literally these groups were almost competing with each other inside the company.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important aspect as well. And with and again, APIs, application programming interfaces, sound like a very technical term.
Yes. Yeah.
But I think if you just imagine, I call it Ethel the switchboard, back in the 50s, people were connecting.
Yes.
Back in the day, interfaces were hard. They were programs unto themselves. If you got it right, great, but hold your breath. Because if anything changed, even data formats, there were issues.
Yeah.
Technology, this middleware, and a good part of the contribution from Silicon Valley and the VCs is all these firms you've never heard of that have made that part easier. The connections just happen, and you can focus on the work. And the information is brought to you, and you can use it. And these routines, whether it's our sales systems, every one of our salespeople, they now know so much that's brought to them about their clients, about the opportunities. Managers know so much about their employees, even if, they didn't this or didn't do that, maybe they have an issue, maybe I should check in with them more, especially now when you're working remotely, so we're recording this. So I think that's the knowledge graph's real input, is it allows someone, without spending all the time on the administrative, to get the results of the phone calls and the follow-ups. The digital brain, again, I think robotic process automation and just general workflow advances, whether it's what's in the Microsofts and the Apples or the Pega systems and the SAPs and the other Salesforces of the world, these workflows are built in, and you don't have to be a programmer. The democratization of these tools is incredible. And I think that as soon as someone says, you know what, if software is indeed eating the world, as Mr. Andreessen said, then that means processes are gradually being digitized or rapidly being digitized, which means these things we thought were manual before are actually digital, which means that you have such power. And conversely, if you avoid it, you're really putting yourself at a weakness. Oh, I'm a strategy person. I'm not a techie like that. That's for the coders. Well, I view it as a language. Just like you might decide to learn German or you might learn something else. If you learn a computer language, or at least the approach, the thinking, the frameworks behind it, then you're allowing yourself to be much more adaptable and productive.
What you're saying is very true and very fascinating. And I want to make sure the audience doesn't lose some of the insights here, because we're talking about how to unleash your employees. So we know that's the overriding objective, right? And then we're talking about certain things companies can do to achieve that goal. The first one we spent a lot of time talking about was how you can take manual, time-draining processes that require employees to step out of what they're being paid to do to complete some forms. These can now be automated so that employees can be freed, right? So that we spoke about that. The other one is, how do you take knowledge that a firm has and make it available to everyone when they need it? I mean, I remember speaking to a partner the other day, and he was telling me, well, all of the work I've done for the last 10 years at the firm is available in a knowledge management database. And I said, yeah, that's true, but do the people that need that know where it is and know where to find what they need within all of those documents? I don't think they know that, unless they search for exactly how that file is named, right? Otherwise, it's going to sit there and it's going to be used maybe a little bit. But coming back to technology, right? You spoke about nudging, which I think is a very important concept here. Because when we talk about rolling out changes in behavior at companies, we tend to, as Americans, like to do things in a big, bang, flashy, scaled process. But what you spoke about there is, how do you get people to change with nudges so that you modify their behavior and routines in a way without them knowing there's a big change taking place? It's very different from the way people like to do things, because we're almost groomed to think, hey, we're going to have this program, we're going to bring in Infosys or someone else, we're going to keep them here for 1 month, and everything we need done is going to happen in 1 month, and we're going to be a brand new company. But what you're saying is it's almost an incremental process. You've got to be constantly identifying things you want to change and modify, and constantly nudge employees. It almost never ends. Is that a good way of capturing it? It never ends.
Yes. And that last sentence is so important, that there's, Cervantes from Don Quixote, he said, the journey is better than the end. In other words, the successive realization of these worthy goals is realistically what your goal is. Because as long as you're continuing to do that, then you aren't worried about achieving the thing and then stopping. And it's not a recipe for never being happy. It's the opposite.
You've got to accept it.
Exactly. In fact, embrace it. Yeah. Because if we do say the continuous improvement is a good thing.
Is continuous, as the name says.
Yes. And a concept, I don't know if we coined the term or not, but one of our founders framed a term called learnability. The ability to learn. Yeah. Because you'll think about it. How are kids or anyone really taught to learn? They're taught stuff, but learning how to learn.
Yes.
And I think as soon as we incorporate that, well, guess what? You will use that knowledge management more. And people lean in to wanting to share, because it's a self-reinforcing structure. I tell people, if you really want to know something, go teach it. Because that will reinforce. Because it's one thing to know something. It's another to articulate it, to put it in words so that the person listening to your message is hearing. That pipe of comprehension from them gets broad and very quickly. In fact, that's probably, like in your consulting days, the reason that senior executives pay rather large fees to consulting firms, the best ones, let's say, are because they can get more in 10 minutes or an hour than maybe somebody gave them in a week. Yeah. At least it's valuable. It's synthesized, not summarized, not watered down, and not just dumped like a pile of bicycle parts on the table in front and say, here's your bike. No, it's assembled, it's tuned, and as instruction and a little guided demo, and you can now use it very quickly. A complex thing made a little less so.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a few years ago, I was speaking to the chief technology officer of a very large, well-known financial services group. And he was telling me, we had a continuous improvement program that ended 4 years ago. And I'm thinking, but it's called continuous improvement. How can you end it 4 years ago, right? It should be ongoing. And if you think about the concept of a live enterprise, just to get listeners to understand this better, and tell me if I'm paraphrasing it well, it's almost as if you treat a company like it's a person, right? Or an organism, as you say very well in several parts of the book. And like any live organism, you've got to continuously be adjusting and learning new skills as the environment changes. And if you don't keep learning and you don't keep adjusting, you're going to eventually be replaced. So that, to me, is something companies don't do very well. Because it's almost as if every CEO comes in and feels he's got to right the ship, as opposed to preparing the company to always be going through a process of renewal. It's almost the way we measure CEOs is incorrect. We reward a CEO for someone who takes a company to a point where we say they don't need to do much more, they're doing everything right, rather than saying, hey, this guy has put the company in a position whereby it's continuously changing, continuously adapting, and it has a way of reinventing itself. It's almost as if we're prioritizing and rewarding CEOs for the wrong things.
Well said. I think a couple points come out. One, and maybe it's because early in my career, when I was serving clients, I worked with a lot of closely held, large family, and I'll call them maybe mid-tier companies, where they're a lot more private companies. And it was amazing the mindset they took. They thought longer term.
Yes.
And they didn't, some of the language that we take for granted to large public companies never even crept into vocabulary. Yeah,
Wow.
they had a financial statement, and but again, they thought about things longer term. And one of the things, love him or not, love him or hate him, Mr. Bezos over at Amazon, one of the
Yeah.
things that stands out is his ability as a publicly traded company to think long term. And in his mind, or his approach was to defer profits. It was one of but just the ability to have a long term goal in mind, that he was willing as a publicly traded firm to still do that. I think that there are plenty of other reasons why he's been successful. That is not a small part of it, though.
Yeah. I was speaking to I can't remember who it was. It was a senior partner at Banyan. I can't remember his last name, first name Jeff.
Mm-hmm.
And he was talking to me about a company that has been around for 45, I think, generations. 45 generations. Can you imagine 45 generations? And he said that the thing that stands out for him is, as you've said clearly here, is that they don't think about profits. They don't think about shareholder return. That's not what drives them. What drives them is the need to be the best, the need to solve a problem, but most importantly, especially if it's a smaller business, the identity of the founder or family is so closely woven to the business that it's a sense of a personal mission and pride to build a legacy. And what I find today, when in the corporate world, it's almost as if we don't look for those people that are personally vested in a business to run it. We look for the smartest person who went to the best school and had the best exit 5 years ago, and we bring them in to run the business. And if they fail, they're going to leave, get a better job. But it's that sense of pride and belonging that's almost missing in many companies that don't have that sustainability with them.
Well said, because personally, growing up on a farm and knowing, having a farm in our family for 7 generations, for example, and then having a lot of that around, you grow up thinking that's the way it is.
Yeah.
It's an aberration not to. And then you hit the corporate world. And Infosys obviously hasn't been around for 45 generations.
Yes.
But in a sense, there has been that continuity, and there is a sense, I call it the genie still being in the bottle. There's still a sense of that, especially among the older guard, the old guard of it. And I think that is something people do have. They really feel there's a legacy. And again, plenty of warts. Every company has them, but I think that is an element that's there. Yeah, I just think that sense of pride and that sense that's going beyond. I think for talent, we had a discussion on talent.
Yeah.
I think finding a way for someone to be part of something bigger than themselves.
Yes.
Sense of purpose. And again, I'm well past what I'll call the new generation coming out of college. There's plenty of years separating. One of the things I like a lot about the more recent hires, I do think there's a sense of purpose. Not all, maybe sometimes misguided, depending on. But I think having a sense of purpose though is great. And it really works when it can be aligned to something, because you can't just ignore business. Yes. Even in a triple bottom line, even in this stakeholder capitalism, you have to have the engine that creates the goodness, that creates the value, so you can use it to pay your people more, to invest, especially overinvest, maybe in the environment and social and everything else. So you have to be really strong. There is no political leadership or impact without economic leadership and impact as well. I think that sense of purpose, and it's one of the reasons why I really enjoyed, not all partners in consulting firm love working with people coming out of school. They want to get the experts and I really enjoyed that though, because there was such a sense of energy and the learning. You could take someone who had no experience in an area. If you gave them the frameworks, the guidance, showed them, and worked very closely, intensely for a little bit, backed away, it's amazing what a committed, intelligent, hardworking person can do, especially if there's a sense of purpose. And it's hard in any company, but if you can get that, I do believe it's an element of it. Yeah,
I mean, what you said is 100% correct. And to build on that, if you look at most companies that belong to a similar sector, we can take consulting firms, for example, or even Infosys in the tech space. Over time, their competitors reach parity on certain assets that they have. In the case of consulting firms, it's whether it's frameworks and toolkits and methodologies, right? But when firms reach parity in those capabilities, what distinguishes them is their culture and sense of purpose. Because the really good firms have a very almost distilled sense of purpose, so that when you leave these people alone in a room and they have to make a decision for which they will never be called out, you know they'll make the right decision. But you've seen scandals with many firms across many sectors whereby they may have the right assets, but if they don't have the right sense of purpose, they ultimately mess up and sometimes fail miserably. And it seems if you want to, as you say, as Infosys has a legacy, a culture where people believe they're pursuing something greater than themselves, unless you have that, at some point, someone's going to catch you up. Someone's going to replicate what you have. So how do you do that? How do you build this greater than yourself sense of purpose at a company? How has Infosys done that? How have you seen other clients do that?
Well, I think we had our ebbs and flows.
Yeah.
I believe that it was there. I joined in 2005, so I, almost 16 years. And
Yeah.
I've seen a lot. Growth from 1 billion to 13, 40,000 employees to 250,000 almost, and
Wow.
from one of the first people in our consulting unit. So yeah, I've seen a lot of iterations there. I think once the original founders had kind of reached the end, of their time as CEO, I think there was a staleness that was setting in. Operationally, fantastic. But I think there was just starting to see, not the end of, but maybe, like I said, asymptotically coming to a flat level. And what I think is amazing, it's almost like a new S-curve has been introduced.
Yes.
So continuous improvement has a place to flourish again. I think periodically a continuous improvement only mindset, can anybody say Japan in the 1990s?
Yeah.
Reaches a logical conclusion. It isn't that it's bad, it's fantastic. It's compound interest, but with a ceiling. And then every once in a while, you have to inject this very fresh, dramatic thing.
Yes.
Or at least continue that refreshing of the innovation or these fresh ideas. It's the combination. I love the concept of the duality,
Mm-hmm.
either dichotomous or at least non-coupled thoughts that you hold simultaneously, like continuous improvement and creativity.
Yes.
They're not the same. It's like a lawyer almost arguing two sides of the case. You have to keep both of these in mind and periodically shift to one
Mm-hmm.
or the other. And I think what Infosys did is it was able to shift, very efficient for a long time. And then I think it shifted towards the freshness aspect. And again, credit to CEO we had for some time, Dr. Vishal Sikka, who interjected a love again of the programmer,
Yeah.
of the coder, not just the manager. And while no one's perfect, that element was like a jolt
Yes.
that reinvigorated the practitioner. And then when Nandan came back, he brought back several other items. And so I think that if companies can balance those two, and their HR policies and their people culture reflects it, I think there are a lot of different ways to organize for it. But if keeping those in mind, I think will allow this other word, I do want to make sure we cover it, resilience. I know it's been used a lot this year.
Yeah.
But I've become very enamored with it over the course of the last year because, I was part of the lean movement. All these greasy, smelly factories throughout the American Midwest and almost every continent. And I took pride in the ability to save people money, to clean things up. And if you ever read The Goal, I actually knew some people who were actually portrayed in that book. And so it was great. The issue, though, it got so lean that if you had a hiccup, if they used to say in the automotive world, if you missed a 4-hour window, you're in trouble as a supplier.
Well, we've seen that over the last few months, right?
Yes. And even before that, the writing was on the wall because working with some of the largest high-tech companies, the semicon, the Fuji, the nuclear reactor in Japan and some of the tsunamis, boom, their chips weren't there and they were dead in the water. So gradually, for strategic commodities, buffers were built in.
Yes.
I mean, we believe in buffers, right? We have life insurance, right? That's why. Not because you want it. It's because it's a buffer built in and you weigh the odds. I think this year has taught us, and this goes back to the point about private companies in the sense of long-term purpose.
Mm-hmm.
It's more important to be a little safer.
Yes.
And buffer against the unlikely but dramatic bad thing rather than the likely but not guaranteed good thing or best situation. Maybe you should have ability to operate when there's no power.
Yes.
Maybe you should have the ability to operate even if people can't come to a place or you can't do certain things you took for granted. And I believe that resilience, especially with the administration in the U.S. coming in and even some of the changing winds worldwide, that there'll be an appreciation not just for EBITDA.
Yeah.
So the ability for the stakeholder capitalism, for the World Economic Forum, rippling some of these things, because the ultimate resilience might be planetary resilience, right?
Yeah.
People resilience, monetary resilience, your system of government resilience, the ability to function and hopefully function well. So I think resilience is an important term that, again, you operate with that duality of efficiency. So I think keeping both those in mind.
Well, what you said now is very important. So let's unpack that, because I want the listeners to think about this very carefully. The definition of resilience is where I think we hit a stumbling block. And I'll give an example of this. If you look at a extremely fit triathlete with very little fat on their body, this person would be talked about, photographed, and featured in quite a few magazines because they have what many people would consider to be the ideal physique for a healthy lifestyle, right? But that person, because of the little amount of fat they have on their body, they have to consume a large amount of protein bars very frequently, or they're not going to make it, right? And it only works for them if they have access to that supply, versus someone else who may not be as lean, but has a little bit more fat on their body and can operate for longer periods without the replenishment. And for a long time, we've treated companies like that world famous triathlete, who only is world famous if the supply system works for them. And we punished companies that kept stock on hand, that kept a buffer, that kept back cash and wouldn't pay it out as dividends, who wouldn't buy back stock. I mean, we've seen companies, their share prices took a hit. Do you think we'll now see a switch in the way we are valuing companies, in the strategies that they're pursuing, and what we consider to be resiliency? Will that definition change?
I'm going to answer that in about 20 seconds. Before that, in addition to the triathlete's body, or the supply line, what about because you have one or two rock stars that if you lose them, you're in trouble?
That too, yes.
What about if you're depending on very cheap debt or some financial situation in the marketplace, kind of like before the Great Recession 2009? So I think there are multiple ways that you can appear to be doing well when below the surface you're not. Yes, I think it's important. And while time will tell if stakeholder capitalism will be as profitable in the, using the old metrics as is the old shareholder capitalism, I do believe it will be more resilient because it will build in, some will say overhead, but certainly buffers that people will think about decisions a little more. People are going to think about the impact that when they buy something, about their suppliers. For example, these technologies, people don't realize what a fundamental change they have on the way we operate, like blockchain, for example.
Yes.
It sounds like a cool thing on its own, but the real impact is going to be this visibility and provenance of the supply chain and the ability to track and trace things you couldn't trace before, which means these ideas about unfair labor practices and wages and counterfeit goods and conflict minerals.
Yes.
All the orders stopped.
Yeah.
And they were able to take a deep breath, realize they would literally have almost no shipments for a month or at least a period of time. And they were able to do that because of the way they were structured. They were a closely held company, and their family had a very strong long-term mindset. And it's amazing how they took care of what was important with employees' families and the relationships they had with their suppliers and customers. And I had a front row seat as to how I think it should be done.
I want to just talk more about resiliency because it's such a central component of a live enterprise. It seems to me, and tell me if you agree, that when we've been rewarding resiliency in companies, we seem to put an obsessive focus on performance without considering the health of the business. And what COVID has shown us is that quite a few businesses that were performing well were not that healthy. They didn't have the right processes to deal with disruptions. And maybe what we'll see going forward is the shareholding community starting to value health a little bit more than just performance.
It's funny you mention that because part of the work that I do at the Knowledge Institute is our larger research work. And there's a book project, a colleague of mine who I'm helping him with, and it's on smart spaces and smart buildings. And the reason I bring that up is that a large part of our research has been with firms that run like all of Manhattan's office space or massive companies that operate buildings or smart cities. And what you just said is so true, because the ability to literally monitor the health of the people in the buildings is now a critical success factor.
Wow, that's amazing.
And the guests that come in and how they interact. And of course, just the systems for physical health. Then there's the actual, I'll call it digital health.
Yes.
Are they strong enough that if employee works from home or from the office, it's seamless? You might say, of course, we have our VPN. Can you instantly switch 98% of your people like that? And I'll tell you, we had to do that. I mean, many companies did. We had 200,000 people in less than a week that flipped from one to the other. And many of these people, keep in mind, were dealing with client data, not even our own.
Yes.
And thankfully, we had been down that cloud journey and this live enterprise journey for a while. And I think that really separated the companies that took the step, a year, 2 years ago and had some level of maturity with it, and the ones that didn't. And I think that's also manifesting, showing the manifest how resilience is going to be measured going forward. Can you anticipate not only the things that you don't know, but even the things that you need to be able to do, just do them very easily to give flexibility.
Yeah, it's funny, right? Pre-COVID, before February of this year, when we talked about the health of a business, we meant assets, debt, liabilities, and so on. But now when we mean the health of the business, we quite literally mean the health of your employees. And whether you can measure that, deal with it, help them, put in place the right processes, it's as if the crisis has forced us to rethink the way we manage our businesses, but in a very fundamentally different way.
Agreed. And then there's the dimension of even business travel.
Yeah.
It's been the great burning platform, or pushing somebody, to jump in the water and learn to swim, because some things that weren't done before because it wasn't convenient, the perceived risks, the unknown. Well, we have to do it because alternatives are worse. So let's try it. And no, let's not just try it. Let's make it work because we have to. It's amazing what we do when we have to.
Yes.
And now that it works, what are we going back to? Are we going back? What kind of hybrid emerges?
Yes, all questions that the world is still trying to answer, and I'm sure you guys are helping them with that. Jeff, thank you so much. This was a fascinating call. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot, and I think our listeners are going to enjoy it as well.
Well, I appreciate the way you asked the questions in a very thoughtful way, because it helped us both dig a little deeper, and I truly hope that your audience finds a few insights they can take away, because I think the stakes are too high. The companies that are out there, such an awesome opportunity. We don't need to churn through these. We don't need to have the S&P continue to shrink in its longevity for companies. Why not actually flip this and let's have it start to be a little longer, because the companies reinvent themselves?
Oh, that's a good way of looking at it, because I agree with you. A crisis is when the world responds best. And why should we let this crisis go to waste? Because we're seeing companies do things they had never considered before. And they seem to be doing a pretty good job at it as well, even though initially they were complaining a lot. But they got their act together, and it seems to be going pretty smoothly.
Agreed. Thanks for having me. Really enjoyed it.
Take care, Jeff. Enjoy your day.
Thanks. Bye-bye.